She was a widow, living in memories. Then he smiled, and suddenly, life felt worth remembering again. The first time I saw her, she was sitting alone in the corner of a small, sunlit cafe, a stack of old letters spread before her like fragile memories. The morning light hit her hair just so, a soft amber glow that seemed almost too warm to be real. She looked up briefly, eyes distant, as if she were somewhere between past and present, a quiet melancholy framing the curve of her lips. There was a grace to her, subtle and unassuming, a presence that somehow demanded attention without asking for it. I didn't mean to stare. I tried to focus on my laptop, on the hum of the coffee machine, on the low murmur of conversations around me, but something about her drew my gaze back again and again. She sighed softly, and a loose pen rolled off the table, tumbling to the floor near my feet. On instinct, I picked it up and held it out. Our hands brushed, briefly, almost accidentally, but long enough that I felt a spark of something I didn't yet understand. She looked at me then, really looked, and for a fleeting second, the sadness in her eyes softened. She smiled, a little awkwardly at first, but genuine. It was a smile that carried a lifetime of unspoken stories, of grief and resilience, and for some reason, it made the air around me feel warmer. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but steady, like someone who had spoken too little to strangers in recent years. "You're welcome," I replied, my own words sounding simpler than they felt. I wanted to say more, to ask about the letters, to understand why she seemed both so present and so distant, but I didn't. I returned to my table, but now the hum of the cafe seemed different, richer, warmer, as if the sunlight had suddenly pooled around her corner and filled the space with quiet possibility. I found myself stealing glances, noticing the small things, the way her fingers lingered over the paper, the faint creases of her thoughtful frown, the way her eyes softened when she looked out the window at nothing in particular. I didn't know her name, or her story, or if she would even remember our brief touch 5 minutes from now. But something had shifted. The ordinary rhythm of the morning had tilted, and I felt the strange pull of curiosity mixed with something heavier, almost like recognition. Before leaving, I lingered by the counter, hesitating. I caught her eye one last time, and she offered a small, almost shy nod, an acknowledgement that somehow, we had crossed paths in more than just the physical sense. I smiled back, though it felt inadequate compared to the one she had given me. And that was the moment I realized, life could surprise you, even in the quiet corners of a sunlit cafe, even through the briefest touch. Somehow, she had already started to matter to me, and I didn't yet know why. The next few mornings, I found myself returning to that same corner of the cafe, almost as if the universe had reserved it for her, and me. I told myself it was coincidence, that maybe she was just a fixture of this quiet little neighborhood, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The first time I spoke to her, it was entirely accidental. I reached for the last croissant on the counter at the same moment she did. Our hands brushed again, and I felt that same subtle jolt of awareness I'd felt before. She laughed, a soft, musical sound that didn't fill the room, but filled something in me I didn't know needed filling. "I think we have a problem," she said, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "2 people, 1 pastry. Seems like fate has a sweet tooth," I replied, smiling despite myself. And just like that, a conversation began, tentative, polite at first, like stepping onto ice you aren't sure will hold your weight. We talked about nothing and everything, the cafe, the changing seasons, books that had shaped us. Her voice was calm and steady, but there was a flicker in her eyes that hinted at memories tucked just out of reach. I noticed the way she would brush a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thoughtful, the way her lips curved just so when she laughed at something small and mundane. Every gesture felt deliberate, intimate, and somehow unbearably human. Over the next few weeks, these conversations became our routine, though neither of us admitted it. I would arrive early, sometimes reading or pretending to work, just so I could catch a glimpse of her before she noticed me. And when our eyes met across the cafe, a quiet understanding passed between us, no words necessary, just the gentle acknowledgement of familiarity growing into something more. One afternoon, we found ourselves walking together after our usual coffee ritual. She paused to admire a small mural painted on a brick wall, tilting her head as if seeing it for the first time. I caught her wrist lightly to keep her from stepping too close to the curb. The touch was brief, unassuming, but it left a warmth lingering, a pulse that made my chest tighten in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "I like your perspective," she said softly, almost to herself. "You notice details most people miss." I shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I just pay attention. Maybe I notice more when someone worth noticing is around." My words felt too forward, too clumsy, but she didn't recoil. Instead, her smile softened, a quiet acknowledgement that she felt it too. By the time we parted that day, the sunlight had begun to filter through the trees, casting dappled patterns across the sidewalk. I lingered longer than necessary, watching her walk away, noticing the sway of her coat, the gentle rhythm of her steps. There was a connection forming here, delicate, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. And as I walked home, I realized it wasn't just curiosity that drew me to her anymore. It was something heavier, deeper, the quiet hope that, in these unplanned conversations, we were beginning to find fragments of each other, small pieces that, over time, might form something neither of us had expected but both desperately needed. It was one of those rainy afternoons when the city felt muffled and intimate, the kind of weather that makes strangers seem closer without touching them. I spotted her sitting by the window in the cafe, the soft drizzle tracing delicate rivulets down the glass behind her. She had her coat wrapped tightly around her, yet there was a calmness in her posture, an almost imperceptible grace in the way she rested her chin in her hands. I hesitated before approaching, unsure if I should intrude or simply leave her in her quiet space. But something in me knew she wouldn't want to be left alone, and as I stepped closer, the faint scent of her perfume mingled with the warm aroma of coffee, wrapping around me like a memory I hadn't lived yet. "Mind if I sit?" I asked, though the question was almost unnecessary. She looked up, eyes softening as she met mine, and nodded. "I was hoping you would," she said, a small smile curving her lips. We sat across from each other, the table small enough that our knees brushed occasionally. The first few minutes were filled with the usual light chatter, the rain, the cafe, the muted hum of conversations around us. Then, almost naturally, she spoke of him. Her late husband. Not in sorrowful tones, not in dramatic flourishes, but with quiet honesty that made my chest ache with both admiration and empathy. "I sometimes forget how to live without him," she admitted, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "And then, little things happen, like someone smiling at me, and I remember that maybe life isn't entirely over." Her words hung in the air, tender and fragile. I wanted to say something profound, something that could bridge the gap between our worlds, but all I could do was nod, feeling the weight of her honesty pressing gently against my heart. "I know it's strange," she continued, "to talk to someone I barely know about something so personal." "It's not strange," I said softly, "it's human. And I want to listen, if you let me." Our hands met briefly when she steadied my own fumbling fingers as I reached for my cup. Her touch was light, almost hesitant, but electric in its subtlety. I felt the warmth of her skin, the quiet strength beneath her gentleness, and for a moment, the rain outside didn't exist. The cafe seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, hearts exposed, words unnecessary. She laughed softly, a sound that seemed to shake the weight of grief from the corners of the room. I noticed the way her eyes sparkled despite the sadness behind them, the curve of her cheek when she smiled, and the way her presence made even silence feel meaningful. By the time we parted, I felt as if we had traversed a small, secret world together, one of honesty, fragility, and the quiet acknowledgement that our lives, though different, were beginning to intertwine. I walked away with her words lingering in my mind, and a realization settled deep inside me: connection wasn't about rushing or forcing closeness, it was about noticing, understanding, and holding space for someone's heart, even when it trembled with old pain. And I wanted, more than anything, to keep being the person she could share those tremors with. After that rainy afternoon, things changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly. Our conversations, once light and exploratory, now carried a weight neither of us fully acknowledged. The connection was undeniable, yet every time I thought about approaching her, a knot of hesitation twisted in my chest. She, too, seemed more careful, her smiles tinged with caution, her gestures measured. I remember one evening in the cafe, the golden glow of the sunset spilling across the worn wooden tables. She sat in her usual corner, a book in hand, but her eyes kept darting toward the door, as if bracing herself for the world outside. I approached, my own heartbeat quickening with a strange mix of anticipation and fear. "Hi," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Hi," she replied, her tone soft, polite, yet carrying an unspoken distance. We talked about ordinary things at first, the new exhibits at the local gallery, a recipe she had tried recently, the changing weather. But beneath the surface, an unspoken tension lingered, hovering over us like a fragile glass dome. Every touch, every glance, had to be measured. When I reached across to point out something in her book, our fingers brushed. She pulled back slightly, not in rejection, but in hesitation. The brush of her skin against mine left a lingering warmth, a spark that neither of us could ignore. As I sat back, I caught myself studying her more than the pages of my own notebook. She seemed caught between two worlds, one of memory and grief, one of tentative possibility. I sensed her struggle, and I felt my own mirrored within her, the fear of moving too fast, of trespassing on emotions still raw and tender. I don't know if I should be here," she said suddenly, her voice almost a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile bubble of safety we had created. "You don't have to decide anything," I told her, keeping my words steady. "We can just be here. That's enough." She looked at me then, eyes searching, and for a moment the air between us was heavy with everything unsaid. I wanted to reach for her, to bridge the distance with a touch that said more than words ever could, but I held back, respecting the boundaries she had silently set. Even so, the brief moments when her arm brushed mine or our knees touched beneath the table carried a charge, a quiet acknowledgement of the desire simmering beneath restraint. The restraint itself became part of the intimacy, each hesitated touch, each lingering glance, a conversation in its own right. By the time we left the cafe, the streetlights were flickering on, casting a soft glow over wet pavement. We walked side by side, close but not touching, the distance deliberate yet comforting. It was clear neither of us was ready to rush, yet neither of us could deny the pull between us. That night, as I replayed our afternoon in my mind, I realized that hesitation wasn't a barrier, it was a kind of respect, a mutual acknowledgement that what we were beginning to feel deserved care. And somehow, in the carefulness of our boundaries, the slow burn of something far deeper began to take root. The city had a quiet energy that afternoon, as if it knew something small and precious was about to unfold. I found her at the cafe again, the same table by the window where sunlight pooled like liquid gold. She looked up as I approached, her eyes lighting with that familiar spark, the one that had first drawn me to her, and smiled, the warmth of it catching me off guard. "I found something you might like," she said, holding up a small notebook, its pages filled with sketches of flowers and city streets. Her handwriting was delicate, precise, with tiny annotations that revealed her subtle humor. We spent the next hour wandering through a nearby park, laughing softly over the sketches, pointing out details in the surroundings she had captured so well. She tilted her head to admire a cluster of tulips, and I found myself noting the way her fingers brushed the petals as if she were tracing memories, not just flowers. When she caught me staring, she laughed, that musical, low laugh, and I felt my chest tighten with a sudden, delicious awareness that I was completely and irrevocably drawn to her. At a narrow path lined with cherry trees, I instinctively reached out to guide her past a puddle. My hand barely touched hers, fingers brushing in a fleeting, electric connection. She didn't pull away. Instead, she gave a small, approving nod, a gesture so subtle that only someone paying attention would notice, and I realized that these tiny moments were slowly weaving an intimacy far stronger than words could ever express. We stopped at a small bench overlooking a fountain, the water shimmering in the afternoon sun. She handed me a thermos of coffee, our fingers touching briefly as I took it. The warmth of her hand lingered against mine, and I felt an unexpected calm settle over me, a quiet reassurance that life, even in its smallest pleasures, could still surprise you. You know, she said softly, her eyes meeting mine, when you're around, it's easier to forget the heaviness for a little while. Even just for a moment. I smiled, feeling a tug of emotion I wasn't ready to name. I think the world feels lighter when we notice it together, I replied. The sun dipped lower, casting a honeyed glow across her hair, and for a moment, the park felt like our own secret corner of the universe. She leaned just slightly closer, her shoulder brushing mine, and I could feel the warmth radiating from her, a gentle reassurance that our growing connection was safe, tender, and mutual. On the way back, she paused at a small mural on a brick wall, turning to me with a grin. You have to see this, she insisted, dragging me closer. I laughed, letting her lead, noticing how easy it was to follow her, how natural it felt to move in sync without planning or prompting. By the time we parted, the city lights were flickering to life, painting the streets in soft amber tones. She waved, a playful sparkle in her eyes, and I realized that these small, shared joys, the laughter, the brushes of touch, the quiet moments of attention, were gradually dissolving the caution that had kept us distant. Slowly, imperceptibly, we were beginning to allow ourselves to enjoy each other's company in a way that felt effortless, real, and profoundly human. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that softens the world and makes it feel as if time itself has slowed. The streets glistened under the gray sky, and the cafe, our usual refuge, smelled of warm pastries and freshly brewed coffee, an almost intoxicating combination that wrapped around us like a gentle embrace. She was already there when I arrived, seated in our corner by the window, her coat still damp from the drizzle. She looked up as I approached, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, the smile that had first drawn me in, now carrying a depth I could feel in my chest. We ordered coffee and sat opposite each other, the table small enough that our knees brushed intermittently. The conversation began lightly, as it always did, but soon drifted into quieter, more vulnerable territory. Her voice softened, almost a whisper, as she spoke of dreams she had set aside, fears she hadn't shared, and the loneliness that lingered even in ordinary days. I don't know if I can trust myself to feel this way again, she admitted, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup absent-mindedly. It feels strange, and yet, it feels necessary. I nodded, feeling the truth of her words resonate inside me. I understand, I said softly. I feel the same. It's like stepping into a new world, one where we have to learn how to care without losing ourselves. Our hands met on the table when I reached for mine, a deliberate yet gentle gesture that neither of us had attempted before. Her fingers rested lightly against mine, warmth mingling with a shiver that traveled up my arm. The touch was electric in its subtlety, a quiet confession that said more than words ever could. I could feel the pulse of her heartbeat through the delicate press of her palm, steady and alive, and it anchored me in the moment. For a while, we simply sat there, hands entwined, letting silence fill the space, a silence that was not empty, but heavy with meaning. The rain outside tapped softly against the window, the rhythm almost like a heartbeat echoing our own, a reminder that the world was vast and messy, yet somehow this little corner was ours. She leaned forward slightly, foreheads almost touching, and I caught the faintest breath of her perfume, mingling with the rich aroma of coffee. I think I've been afraid to feel like this, she said, voice trembling just enough to make my chest ache. But with you, it feels safe. It feels right. I smiled, leaning in slightly so our shoulders brushed. It feels right to me too, I murmured. And in that small, unassuming gesture, a shared warmth, a lingering glance, the gentle touch of fingers, we both understood something unspoken, that connection, trust, and desire could coexist, quietly and beautifully, without rushing or demanding. By the time we left, the rain had slowed to a mist, and the city glowed softly under the pale afternoon light. We walked side by side, closer than usual, our hands brushing and occasionally intertwining, each touch a quiet promise, a confession of something that neither of us could yet name but both felt deeply. For the first time, I realized that love, the kind that lingers in glances, touches, and shared silences, didn't need to be loud to be real. The sunlight that morning streamed through the cafe window like golden silk, casting soft patterns across the worn wooden floor. It felt like a new beginning, though neither of us had explicitly said so. I spotted her immediately, seated at our usual corner table, the place where the quiet rhythm of our connection had first taken root. She looked up, and our eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to pause. She smiled at me, that familiar, warm smile that had once caught me off guard, now carrying a quiet assurance. It was the kind of smile that spoke of grief softened into acceptance, of hesitation transformed into trust, and of love acknowledged without urgency. My chest tightened with a mixture of relief and joy as I slid into the seat across from her. We didn't need many words at first. The comfort of presence was enough, the brush of her hand against mine as she passed the sugar, the subtle warmth radiating from her as our knees touched beneath the table, the way our shoulders leaned slightly together without thought or pretense. Each small, deliberate gesture spoke volumes, a language of intimacy that had taken weeks to develop, slow and deliberate, like petals unfolding in the sun. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine with a vulnerability that was no longer edged with fear, "about how easily you make the ordinary feel extraordinary. Being with you, it reminds me that life is still worth living." Her words, though quiet, struck me with profound clarity. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, holding it gently, deliberately. The warmth of her skin, the faint pulse beneath her fingers, made my chest ache in the best possible way. "You don't have to think about it," I whispered, leaning just slightly closer, letting the warmth of my presence speak for the emotions I couldn't yet put into words. "Just, know that being with you makes me feel alive too." She looked down at our hands, then back at me, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. And then, in that moment of quiet understanding, she said the words that had lingered between us from the very beginning, "When you smile, I remember how to live." Time seemed to slow. The hum of the cafe faded into the background, leaving only the two of us, hands entwined, hearts tethered in a silent acknowledgement of the journey we had shared. We didn't need grand gestures or declarations, everything had been said in the small touches, lingering glances, and shared silences that had led us here. As we stepped out of the cafe together, the city felt softer, warmer, almost as if it were celebrating alongside us. Sunlight danced on the wet pavement, and the faint scent of coffee and rain clung to us like a memory. She walked beside me, close enough that our elbows brushed occasionally, her presence steadying me in a way I hadn't realized I needed until that moment. For the first time, the future didn't feel uncertain or heavy. It felt quiet, warm, and infinitely full of possibility. We had crossed the chasm of grief, hesitation, and doubt together, and now, in each other's presence, we were simply alive, aware, connected, and free to embrace what had slowly, beautifully grown between us. And as she smiled again, that simple, life-affirming smile, I knew that life, in all its unpredictability and quiet miracles, had found its way back to both of us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more slow-burn romance tales. Leave a comment below, I'd love to hear which moment in the story made you feel the most alive. And remember, sometimes love finds us in the quietest, most unexpected places.